Imagine standing in the freezing rain, looking at the house you built, only to realize the locks have been changed. Now imagine finding out that the person who locked you out is the daughter you loved, raised, and sacrificed your entire life for. My name is Karen. Today I am 55 years old. Right now I am sitting in a tiny, cold room that belongs to a friend. I have nothing with me except a small suitcase and an old, dusty photo frame. In that photo, three people are smiling. There is Robert, my late husband, with his kind eyes. There is sweet, 6-year-old Lily holding my hand. And there is me, looking like the happiest mother in the world. Looking at this picture, my heart breaks into a million pieces. How did we go from so much love to this cold betrayal? To understand the end, we have to go back to the very beginning. Before I met Robert, my life was very quiet and lonely. I worked as a receptionist at a local hotel. Every day, I stood behind a high wooden desk, handed keys to happy families, and smiled. But when my shift ended, I walked back to a dark, empty apartment. I had no one to cook for, no one to talk to. I wanted a family more than anything. Then, on a warm summer afternoon, Robert walked into the hotel. He was a gentle, polite, and hardworking man. But he was not alone. Holding his hand was a little 6-year-old girl. This was Lily. Her biological mother had left her when she was just a baby. Robert was raising her all by himself. That day, Lily was wearing a bright yellow dress. She was hiding behind her father's legs, looking at me with big, shy eyes. Under her arm, she tightly held an old orange teddy bear with a missing ear. I didn't want her to feel scared. So I walked out from behind my desk and knelt down on the floor so we were at the same height. "Hello, Lily," I said softly. I reached into my pocket and offered her a small, shiny pink hair clip. "My name is Karen." Lily looked at the clip, then up at her father. Robert nodded with a warm smile. Slowly, Lily took a step forward. Her tiny fingers took the clip from my hand. And then she gave me the most beautiful, innocent smile. In that exact second, my heart melted. I did not see her as a stranger's child. I saw her as my own daughter. A year later, Robert and I got married. It was a very small wedding, but our hearts were full. We moved into a cozy little house with a green lawn. Lily finally had her own room. On our first night in the new house, I tucked Lily into bed. She held my hand tightly with her warm, tiny fingers. "Karen," she whispered, her eyes sleepy. "Are you my real mom now?" Tears of joy filled my eyes. I kissed her forehead. "Yes, sweetie, I am your mom, and I will never leave you." Later that night, Robert and I stood on the front porch, looking at the stars. He held my hand. "Thank you, Karen," he whispered. "We are a family now, together forever." I believed him. I truly did. I thought our happiness would last forever. I had no idea that the sweet little girl sleeping in the next room would grow up, steal everything I owned, and leave me standing in the cold rain. The first few months in our new home were like a beautiful dream. Lily was so tiny, and she needed a lot of care, but I was ready to give her all the love in the world. Every single morning, I would wake up early to make her favorite pancakes, pack her little school lunchbox with a sweet handwritten note inside, and gently brush her soft hair into neat pigtails. At first, she was a bit quiet and shy around me, often looking at her father before answering my questions, which was completely normal for a child who had lost her mother. But I never rushed her. Instead, I focused on showing her every single day that she was safe, wanted, and deeply loved in this house. Slowly, the ice began to melt. One rainy afternoon, when Robert was late returning from work, a loud clap of thunder shook the entire house. Lily got so scared that she ran straight into the kitchen, tears streaming down her little face, and threw her tiny arms around my legs. I immediately knelt down, wrapped my arms around her, and rocked her back and forth, whispering that everything was going to be okay and that I would always protect her from the storm. She buried her face in my shoulder, and as her breathing slowed down, she looked up at me with her red, watery eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Mom." Hearing that single, beautiful word for the very first time made my heart burst with absolute joy, and in that moment our bond became unbreakable. We had so much love in our hearts that Robert and I naturally started thinking about expanding our little family. During the first 3 years of our marriage, we tried very hard to have a baby of our own, hoping to give Lily a little brother or sister to play with. Lily herself was incredibly excited about the idea, and she would often run up to me after school, place her warm little hands on my belly, and ask when her new sibling would finally arrive. She even picked out her favorite toys to share with the baby and told me she would teach them how to draw and ride a bicycle. Robert and I would smile, holding hands and dreaming of the day our cozy home would be filled with even more laughter and baby footsteps. Every single month, we hoped for good news, and I started buying tiny baby socks and soft blankets, hiding them in my closet with a heart full of hope and silent prayers. Lily's excitement made our dreams feel so real, and we truly believed that a new blessing was just around the corner to make our perfect little family complete. One beautiful spring morning, my dream finally came true when the test showed two faint pink lines, and I rushed to tell Robert and Lily the wonderful news. We were all so happy, and Lily immediately started planning how she would help me change diapers and sing sweet lullabies to her new baby brother or sister. But our great happiness did not last long, because just 2 months later, a terrible tragedy struck our family. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I suddenly felt a sharp, unbearable pain in my stomach that made me drop the glass plate I was holding, and everything around me went completely dark. When I finally opened my eyes, the bright lights of a hospital room were blinding me, and I saw Robert sitting beside me, holding my hand tightly with tears rolling down his pale face. The doctor walked into the quiet room with a very sad expression and gently told us the heartbreaking news that we had lost our sweet baby. I felt a cold, empty silence wash over me, but the pain did not stop there because the doctor took a deep breath and said there was something else we needed to know. He explained that during the emergency surgery, they discovered my fallopian tubes were permanently fused and severely damaged, which meant I would never be able to get pregnant or bear a child of my own ever again. Hearing those words felt like a heavy door slamming shut on all my dreams of ever holding my own biological baby. I looked at the white ceiling of the hospital room, crying silently as the realization hit me that my body could never create a life, and the nursery room we had started to build would remain forever empty. Robert held me close, whispering that he loved me, but the grief in my heart was so heavy that I felt like I was sinking into a deep, dark ocean with no way to swim back to the surface. After we returned from the hospital, a heavy, painful silence settled over our small home, and for weeks, I could barely bring myself to leave my bed. The nursery room sat entirely empty, and every time I caught a glimpse of the tiny baby socks I had hidden in my closet, my chest would tighten with an unbearable ache. Robert did his best to comfort me, cooking quiet meals and holding me tight while I cried myself to sleep, but the person who truly pulled me out of my deep darkness was young Lily. One afternoon, as I sat weeping quietly on the kitchen floor, she crawled over to me, wrapped her tiny arms tightly around my neck, and wiped my tears with her small hands. She looked into my eyes with so much innocence, and whispered that she was very sorry she couldn't be a big sister, but she promised to love me enough for 2 babies, and asked if she was still enough to make me happy. Hearing her sweet voice say those words suddenly made a bright light switch on inside my shattered heart, and I realized how incredibly selfish I was being by grieving for a child that never was, while ignoring the beautiful girl who was standing right in front of me. I pulled Lily close to my chest, kissing her forehead over and over again, and promised her that she was more than enough, and that from that moment on, she was my entire world. I made a quiet, sacred promise to myself that I did not need to give birth to a child to be a real mother, because Lily Robert was the only daughter I would ever need, and I would spend the rest of my life making sure she felt that unconditional love every single day. Over the next few years, I poured every single ounce of my energy into being the best mother I could possibly be for Lily. To make sure she had everything she needed for school and a comfortable life, I balanced my demanding job as a hotel receptionist with the endless responsibilities of managing our home. I would stand on my feet for 8 hours at the hotel desk, typing, answering calls, and smiling at guests, and then immediately rush home to cook dinner, help Lily with her science projects, and wash her school uniforms. My back would ache and my eyes would burn with fatigue by the end of the day, but the moment I saw Lily's happy face, all my tiredness would instantly vanish. Robert worked incredibly hard too, but his income was modest, so we had to be very careful with our budget, saving every extra penny we could for Lily's future. I stopped buying new clothes or shoes for myself, always wearing my old sweaters and worn-out coats so that Lily could have the pretty dresses and colored pencils she wanted. I wanted her childhood to be filled with absolute happiness, warmth, and comfort, completely untouched by the financial stress we were silently carrying behind the scenes. Whenever I felt exhausted or worried about our mounting bills, I would look at Lily laughing in the living room or showing me a drawing she had made at school, and I would feel a deep sense of pride. I kept reminding myself that no sacrifice was too big for my daughter, and every extra hour I worked at the hotel was a small price to pay for her beautiful smile and her bright, promising future. Time flew by so fast, and before I knew it, Lily was turning 14 years old. She was growing into a beautiful, intelligent young girl, and our home was always filled with warmth, cozy Sunday dinners, and the sweet sound of her laughter. Lily shared an extremely close, loving bond with her father, Robert. They had their own special inside jokes, and she would always run to the front door to hug him the very second he came home from work. Seeing them together made me feel incredibly peaceful, and even though I was her stepmother, Lily treated me with so much respect and love, always calling me Mom with pride. We felt like a tightly knit, perfect little family that could survive any storm as long as we had each other. On her 14th birthday, Robert and I saved up for weeks to surprise her with a beautiful silver locket, and when we placed it around her neck, she hugged us both so tightly, whispering that she was the luckiest girl in the entire world to have us as her parents. It was a cold, dark Tuesday night when our beautiful world was shattered into a million pieces. The rain was pouring heavily outside, and we had just finished a warm family dinner, laughing at some silly joke Robert had made. After Lily went to her bedroom to study, Robert and I sat on the sofa, talking about our plans for the upcoming weekend, when he suddenly stopped talking and gripped his chest in sheer agony. His face turned pale, beads of cold sweat broke out on his forehead, and he gasped for air as he collapsed against my shoulder. I panicked, my heart hammering against my chest as I screamed for Lily to help me, and we desperately called for an ambulance while holding his freezing hands. The ambulance took forever to arrive through the stormy weather, and even though the paramedics worked tirelessly to save him on the way to the hospital, it was already too late. Robert had suffered a sudden, massive heart attack, and the doctor gently walked out to the waiting room to tell us that his heart had stopped beating before we even reached the hospital doors. I fell to my knees on the cold hospital floor, clutching Robert's jacket to my chest, as Lily let out a heartbreaking scream that echoed through the empty, sterile hallways. In a single, devastating second, the kindest man I had ever known, the anchor of our family, was gone forever, leaving Lily and me completely lost and alone in a world that suddenly felt incredibly dark and terrifying. The silence that settled over our house after Robert's funeral was so heavy that it felt hard to breathe. Every single corner of the rooms reminded us of him, his empty coffee mug on the kitchen counter, his favorite brown coat hanging by the front door, and the quiet porch where he used to sit and watch the stars. Lily completely shut herself in her bedroom, refusing to eat or speak, wrapping herself in her father's old sweaters just to feel his presence. But as much as I wanted to lock myself away and grieve my husband, I knew I couldn't afford to break down because the reality of our situation was terrifying. Robert had no life insurance, the medical bills from that terrible night were piling up, and we still had a monthly mortgage to pay on our house. I realized that if I didn't stand up and take control immediately, we would lose the only home Lily had ever known. So I made the hard decision to go to my manager at the hotel and ask for help. I begged for extra work, and soon, I was taking on exhausting double shifts, standing behind the reception desk for 12 to 14 hours every single day, greeting guests with a fake, tired smile while my heart was bleeding inside. I would leave the house in the dark early morning while Lily was still asleep, and return late at night when she had already gone to bed, my feet swollen and my entire body aching with deep fatigue. I had no time to cry, no time to process my own devastating loss, because my only goal was to make sure Lily's life didn't fall apart and that we had enough food on the table. It was a lonely, brutal routine, but every time I felt like giving up, I would look at Lily's quiet face and remind myself that I was the only parent she had left, and I had to protect her at all costs. 4 years passed in a blur of endless work and quiet survival, and finally, the day arrived when Lily graduated from high school. Looking at her standing on the stage in her blue graduation gown, looking so beautiful and bright, my eyes filled with tears of pure pride because I knew Robert was looking down from heaven with a smile. But with graduation came a new, massive challenge. Lily had been accepted into a great college, but the tuition fees, expensive textbooks, and living expenses were far more than my hotel salary could ever cover. I knew how much this meant to her and how hard she had worked, so I didn't hesitate for a single second. I walked to the bank and drained every single penny of my life savings that Robert and I had carefully kept for emergencies. It still wasn't enough, so I begged my manager for even more hours, working overnight shifts at the hotel reception desk, surviving on cheap black coffee and barely 3 hours of sleep a night. My head would spin with exhaustion, my hands would shake from fatigue, and my old sweaters grew more tattered. But I gladly hid my struggles from Lily because I wanted her to walk into college with her head held high. I paid for her tuition, bought her a brand new laptop, and made sure her pockets were filled with allowance money so she would never feel less than her wealthy classmates. I sat alone in our quiet, empty kitchen late at night, eating plain bread to save money, but my heart was full of hope, believing that all my sacrifices were worth it to give my daughter the bright, successful future she truly deserved. With Lily away at college, the house felt larger and quieter than ever, but I kept myself going by working harder than I ever had before. Every month, I would count down the days until the weekend when Lily would come home to visit, and I would spend hours cleaning her room and preparing her favorite home-cooked meals. However, as the semesters passed, I began to notice a subtle change in my daughter. She stopped coming home as often, making excuses about heavy workloads, study groups, and campus events. When she did visit, her eyes were constantly glued to her phone, and she spoke passionately about her new friends who came from wealthy, influential families, often complaining about how small and old-fashioned our little house was. I tried to understand, telling myself that it was only natural for a young girl to be excited about her new, grand life at university, but a small, cold knot of worry began to form deep in my chest. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, she casually mentioned a friend whose parents had bought her a brand new sports car, looking at our worn-out furniture with a look of quiet resentment that cut through my heart like a sharp knife. I swallowed the lump in my throat and reached out to hold her hand, reminding her that while we didn't have much, we had built this home with pure love and hard work, but she simply pulled her hand away with a cold sigh and walked back to her room. By the time Lily reached her final year of college, the distance between us had grown into a vast, silent ocean. She rarely called anymore, and when she did, it was always because she needed money for high-end internship clothes, weekend trips with her wealthy friends, or expensive dinners she couldn't afford to miss if she wanted to fit in. I never said no. Instead, I took out a heavy personal loan against our house, hiding the crushing financial stress from her because I wanted her to feel equal to her peers. Then, a few weeks before her graduation, Lily came home unexpectedly, but she wasn't alone. She brought along a young man named Richard, who belonged to one of the most prominent families in the city. My heart leaped with excitement, and I quickly put on my best dress, which was still a faded, 10-year-old gown, and spent the entire day cooking a grand feast to welcome them. But the moment they walked through the door, I saw a look of pure embarrassment flash across Lily's face as she looked at my worn-out clothes and the chipped paint on our dining table. When Richard politely asked what I did for a living, I smiled proudly and began to talk about my years of hard work at the hotel. Before I could even finish my sentence, Lily sharply cut me off, loudly telling Richard that I was just a distant relative who managed the house, completely denying that I was the mother who had raised her. The words felt like a physical blow to my chest, knocking the wind out of me as I stood there in my own kitchen, looking at the girl I had sacrificed my entire life for, only to realize she was deeply ashamed of my very existence. I had to lock myself in the bathroom to cry silently, biting my hand to muffle my sobs so Richard wouldn't hear, while my daughter laughed in the living room, having easily erased me from her perfect, wealthy new life. The pain of that silent rejection stayed with me for months, but like any mother, I kept making excuses for her, convincing myself that she was just young, ambitious, and under immense pressure to fit into Richard's elite social circle. A few months after graduation, Lily called me to share some incredibly big news. Richard had proposed to her, and they were planning a grand, luxurious wedding at one of the most expensive hotels in the city. I gasped with joy, my eyes filling with happy tears as I congratulated her, eagerly asking when we could meet to start planning her bridal dress and seating arrangements. But there was a long, cold silence on the other end of the line, followed by a heavy sigh that made my heart instantly sink. Lily told me, in a flat, emotionless voice, that Richard's family was highly respectable, and she had told them that her parents had passed away years ago to avoid any awkward questions about her background. She quietly but firmly explained that it would be best if I did not attend the wedding at all, because my presence as a low-income hotel receptionist would completely ruin her reputation and expose the lie she had built. The phone almost slipped from my trembling hand as her harsh, selfish words echoed in my ears, shattering what was left of my bruised and broken heart. I begged her, whispering through my tears that I would sit in the very back row where no one would see me, promising not to say a word to anyone just so I could watch my little girl walk down the aisle in her wedding dress. But Lily didn't care about my tears. She coldly told me that she couldn't risk her future for my feelings, warned me not to show up, and abruptly hung up the phone, leaving me completely alone in the dark, empty house we had once shared. The day of Lily's wedding was the longest and most agonizing day of my entire life. While she was walking down the aisle of a grand, flower-filled ballroom in a designer white dress, surrounded by hundreds of wealthy strangers, I was sitting alone in my dark living room, clutching the old orange teddy bear she had cherished as a child. I spent the entire evening crying until my eyes were swollen and dry, staring at the clock and imagining the exact moment she would exchange vows, desperately wishing I could have been there to tuck her veil behind her ears and tell her how beautiful she looked. In the months that followed, the crushing weight of the loans I had taken out for her education and lifestyle began to catch up with me, and my health started to rapidly deteriorate from years of endless double shifts and starvation. I was drowning in debt, yet I still refused to ask Lily for a single penny of help, knowing she was living a life of luxury in a mansion across the city. Then, one cold afternoon, a shiny black luxury car pulled up in our driveway, and my heart leaped with sudden, foolish hope as Lily stepped out, looking more elegant and distant than ever. I rushed to open the door, my hands trembling with joy, thinking that she had finally missed her mother and come back to make peace. But there was no warmth in her eyes, and she didn't even bother to step inside. Instead, she coldly handed me a thick folder of legal documents. With a completely straight face, she explained that since the house was originally in her father Robert's name, and she was his only biological child, she had legally claimed her inheritance rights over the property. She told me that she and Richard were expanding their business and needed to sell this house immediately for quick capital, giving me a mere 30 days to pack my things and find another place to live. Hearing those words from the girl I had starved myself to raise felt like a poisonous dagger plunging straight into my soul, leaving me completely breathless as I realized she hadn't come to visit her mother. She had come to take away the last piece of shelter I had left in this world. I stood on the porch in a daze of absolute disbelief, my fingers trembling so violently that the heavy legal documents slipped from my hands and scattered across the cold concrete. I looked at the Lily, searching her perfectly made-up face for even a tiny flicker of the sweet, innocent little girl who had once wrapped her arms around my neck and promised to love me enough for two. But all I saw was a cold, arrogant stranger with eyes as hard as stone, looking at me as if I were nothing more than an annoying stain on her expensive leather shoes. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my wrinkled cheeks, and begged her to remember all the sacrifices Robert and I had made, reminding her how I had worked endless double shifts and starved myself just so she could have a bright, successful future. "Lily, please," I sobbed, clutching the hem of her designer coat. "This is the only home I have left. It's the only place where I can still feel your father's presence. Where will I go? I have no savings, no family, and my health is failing me." Lily pulled her coat away from my grasp with a look of pure disgust, taking a step back as if my touch would somehow dirty her. She coldly told me that my emotional drama wouldn't change the law, and that she was simply taking what was rightfully hers by birthright. She warned me that if I didn't pack my bags and vacate the premises within 30 days, she would not hesitate to call the police to have me forcefully thrown out. As she turned around, got back into her luxurious black car, and drove away without a single backward glance, the sky opened up, and a freezing, heavy rain began to pour down on me. I sat there on the cold, wet steps, completely drenched and broken, realizing that the daughter I had loved, raised, and sacrificed my entire life for had just cast me out into the cold world like garbage, leaving me with absolutely nothing but a shattered heart. With my home gone, the next few months became a grueling, daily struggle for survival that pushed me to my absolute physical and emotional limits. My health was rapidly declining, my joints ached constantly from years of standing, and my chest felt tight with a deep, permanent sorrow. But I couldn't afford to stop working. I managed to rent a tiny, damp basement room on the outskirts of the city, where the walls were covered in mold and the only window looked out onto a dark alleyway. I had to take on a second job cleaning offices late at night, just to pay the rent and buy basic medicine, leaving me with only 2 or 3 hours of sleep in a 24-hour cycle. One evening, as I was sweeping the empty corridors of a high-rise office building, my vision suddenly went blurry, my chest tightened painfully, and I collapsed onto the cold, tiled floor. I lay there alone in the dark for what felt like hours, unable to move or call for help, silently wondering if this was how my life would end, forgotten, broken, and swept away like the dust on the floor. When I finally gathered enough strength to sit up, I looked at my cracked, trembling hands and realized that my body was finally giving up on me, worn out by years of starvation, exhaustion, and the heavy, crushing weight of a shattered heart. The morning after my collapse, I realized I couldn't keep going like this anymore. My body was failing, and my tiny basement room felt more like a tomb than a home. With the last bit of strength I had, I packed my remaining belongings into a single, worn-out suitcase and decided to seek shelter in a quiet, run-down part of the city. I was lucky enough to find a kind-hearted, elderly lady named Martha, an old friend from my youth who lived in a small, cramped apartment, and she immediately took me in without asking any questions. She gave me a tiny, cold room with a creaky bed and a single wooden table. But to me, it felt like a sanctuary after months of living in a dark basement. That evening, as I sat on the edge of the bed clutching the dusty, old photo frame of Robert, Lily, and me, a knock on the door startled me. Martha walked in with a warm cup of tea and gently handed me a folded local newspaper, pointing to a small article in the business section with a look of deep concern in her eyes. I took the paper, my hands trembling as I focused on the headline, and my heart stopped when I saw a picture of Lily and Richard standing outside their grand office building. The article explained that their high-end real estate company was facing a massive federal investigation for fraud and tax evasion, and their luxurious assets, including their mansion, were on the verge of being frozen by the state. I stared at the picture of my daughter, looking so beautiful yet so incredibly stressed beneath her expensive makeup, and despite the brutal way she had thrown me out, a familiar, painful wave of motherly worry washed over me, leaving me torn between the deep scars of her betrayal and the instinct to protect her from the storm that was about to destroy her life. The news of the investigation spread through the city like wildfire, and within a few short weeks, the luxurious empire Lily and Richard had built completely crumbled to the ground. The courts found them guilty of massive financial fraud, and the government immediately seized their mansion, their expensive luxury cars, and all of their frozen bank accounts to pay off their enormous debts. Richard, showing his true, cowardly colors the moment the money vanished, packed his bags and fled the country, leaving Lily to face the crushing legal aftermath and the angry creditors all by herself. One cold, rainy evening, as I sat in my tiny room at Martha's apartment knitting a small scarf, a soft, desperate knock sounded at the front door. I walked over and opened it, and my breath caught in my throat. Standing there in the pouring rain, completely drenched, shivering, and clutching a single plastic bag of clothes, was Lily. The arrogant, wealthy woman who had thrown me out of my home was gone. In her place stood a broken, terrified girl with dark circles under her tear-stained eyes, her expensive clothes soaked and ruined. She looked up at me, her lips trembling with shame and cold, and before she could say a word, she collapsed onto her knees on the wet doormat, burying her face in her hands and sobbing hysterically, begging for my forgiveness and a place to hide from the cold, cruel world that had turned its back on her. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring down at my daughter kneeling in the freezing rain, her desperate sobs mixing with the sound of the pouring storm. The painful memories of the day she threw me out of my own home, leaving me in this very same rain, flashed violently through my mind, and for a fleeting second, a cold anger flared deep inside my chest. But as I looked at her shivering, broken form, clutching my worn-out shoes and begging for mercy, the anger quickly dissolved into the pure, unconditional instinct of a mother. I knelt down on the wet floor, wrapped my arms around her trembling shoulders, and pulled her close, letting her cry into my chest just like she used to when she was a little girl. I helped her up, guided her inside my tiny, warm room, and immediately wrapped her in the old, faded sweater of Robert's that she had once loved so much. As she sat shivering on the edge of my creaky bed, sipping a warm cup of tea I had quickly made, she couldn't even look me in the eye, her face burning with deep, suffocating shame. She kept whispering how sorry she was, confessing how Richard had abandoned her the moment they lost everything, and how she had realized too late that the only person who had ever truly loved her for who she was, and not her money, was the mother she had so cruelly discarded. As the night wore on, the heavy rain outside slowly turned into a gentle drizzle, and the quietness of the small room was filled only with the sound of Lily's soft, exhausted breathing. She had finally fallen asleep, still clutching the sleeve of her father's old sweater, her face looking younger and more vulnerable in the dim light than it had in years. I sat in the wooden chair beside the bed, watching her sleep, my heart aching with a complex mix of sorrow, relief, and a strange, quiet peace. I knew that the road ahead of us would be incredibly long and difficult. The debts were still there, her reputation was ruined, and my own health was a fragile thread holding on by sheer willpower. But as I reached out and gently brushed a damp strand of hair away from her forehead, I realized that the grand, expensive illusion that had stolen my daughter away from me was finally gone, shattered by the harsh reality of the world. We had absolutely nothing left to our names. No house, no wealth, no fancy titles. But in that tiny, cramped room, with my daughter safe by my side, I felt a spark of hope that I hadn't felt since the night Robert passed away. We would have to rebuild our lives from the very bottom, working day by day to heal the deep, painful scars of betrayal and rebuild the trust that had been so easily thrown away. But for the first time in years, we were together, and I knew that no matter how dark the coming days might be, we would face them as a family. The next morning, the weak winter sun peeked through the dusty window, but the light did not bring the instant warmth of forgiveness. As Lily slowly woke up, her eyes adjusting to the peeling wallpaper of the tiny room, she saw me sitting at the wooden table. The silence between us was heavy, filled with the ghosts of the years she had spent pretending I didn't exist. I had placed a simple cup of black tea and a single slice of dry bread on the table. Lily looked at the humble food, then at my hands, cracked, rough, and trembling slightly as I poured water. She reached out to touch my arm, her lips parting to offer another desperate apology, but I gently yet firmly pulled my hand away, leaving her touch hanging in the cold air. I looked her in the eyes, showing no anger but a deep, exhausting sadness that cut her deeper than any scream. "Words are easy, Lily," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But trust is not." Realizing that tears would no longer wash away her sins, she quietly stood up, pulled on her damp, ruined coat, and walked out into the cold morning to find work. She spent hours walking from one end of the district to the other, her fancy degree useless in the shadow of her public scandal. By evening, she had begged for a job at a loud, grease-stained diner near the docks, washing heavy iron pots in freezing water. When she returned that night, her hands were swollen, red, and smelled of cheap bleach, and her shoulders were slumped with a raw fatigue she had never known in her life. She silently placed her few earned coins on the edge of the table, not expecting a hug or a smile, but simply waiting to see if I would let her stay another night in the only room she had left. Days slowly blurred into weeks, and the cold silence in our tiny basement room began to shape itself into a fragile, uneasy routine. Lily was always the first to leave, waking up before dawn when the air was still freezing, slipping quietly out of the room so she wouldn't disturb my sleep. Her work at the dockside diner was brutal. She spent 10 to 12 hours a day scrubbing grease-caked stoves and carrying heavy crates of rotten vegetables, a far cry from the air-conditioned offices she had once ruled. My body, exhausted by years of carrying a heavy heart, spent most of the day in the small wooden chair by the moldy wall, but I refused to let myself be a burden. I helped Martha sew cheap canvas bags, my stiff, aching fingers working through the rough material to earn whatever small coins I could. Every evening when Lily returned, the air between us remained tense and guarded. She never complained about her raw, blistered hands or the insults hurled at her by angry customers, but instead of the warm reconciliation she had probably hoped for, I kept my distance. When she placed her meager wages on the table, I simply nodded, divided the money for rent and cheap medicine, and went back to my sewing. One rainy night, as she sat on the cold floor trying to patch a hole in her worn-out shoes, she looked up at me with tired, pleading eyes. "Do you think Dad would have ever forgiven me, Mom?" she whispered, her voice trembling in the dark. I stopped my needle, staring at the faded photo of Robert on the table before looking down at her. "Your father loved you blindly, Lily," I said, my voice flat and devoid of the easy comfort she sought. "But he isn't the one who had to watch his wife starve on the streets while his daughter lived in a mansion." The words hung heavy in the damp air, a stark reminder that while she was working to survive, the deep, bleeding wounds of her betrayal would take much more than a few washed dishes to heal. The biting winter cold slowly gave way to a damp, humid spring, but the atmosphere inside our tiny basement room remained just as heavy. Lily's hands, once soft and adorned with expensive rings, were now permanently calloused and scarred from the harsh chemicals she used at the diner. She had taken on a double shift, working until past midnight, her face growing thinner and paler by the day as she survived on the leftover scraps the cook let her take home. Yet, despite her exhausting efforts, there were no sudden promotions or miracle jobs waiting for her. She was just another nameless worker struggling in the poorest corner of the city. I watched her quiet struggle with a conflicted heart. Part of me, the mother who had raised her, wanted to pull her into my arms and tell her the punishment was enough. But the memory of the cold rain on the night she had me thrown out of her mansion still lingered like a shadow. One evening, Lily came home much later than usual, her clothes smelling heavily of stale grease and her face bruised near her cheekbone. When I stood up startled, she quickly looked down, trying to hide her face in the collar of her worn jacket. After a long, tense silence, she admitted that a group of wealthy young people, former friends who used to flatter her for her money, had walked into the diner. Recognizing her behind the counter, they had mocked her, spilled their drinks on her shoes, and when she tried to ignore them, one of them had roughly shoved her against a metal prep table. As she recounted the humiliation, she didn't cry or scream. Instead, she looked up at me with a hollow, empty expression. "They treated me like I was nothing, Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And the worst part is, I realized that's exactly how I used to treat you. I deserved every bit of it." For the first time in months, I reached out and gently touched her bruised cheek, my fingers feeling the cold, damp sweat on her skin. I didn't say that everything was forgiven, but as I quietly walked over to fetch a cold compress and sat down beside her on the edge of the creaky bed, Lily rested her forehead against my shoulder, shivering silently as she realized that the road to redemption was paved with the very same stones of humiliation she had once thrown at others. The bruises on Lily's face eventually faded, but the quiet shift inside our tiny room remained. She did not stop working those brutal double shifts, nor did she expect me to suddenly forget the years of neglect. Instead, a silent understanding grew between us, a quiet truce built not on grand gestures, but on the small, repetitive acts of daily survival. I still spent my afternoons sewing canvas bags, but my chest didn't feel quite as tight, and Lily no longer walked into the room with her head bowed in defensive shame. She had accepted her reality, and in doing so, she had finally stopped running from her guilt. One late evening, as a sudden thunderstorm rattled the thin window pane, the power in our building abruptly cut out, plunging our basement room into pitch-black darkness. I gasped, my old bones stiffening with a sudden wave of panic as my mind flashed back to the cold night I had been abandoned in the dark streets. Within seconds, a small, warm hand found mine in the dark. It was Lily. She didn't say a word. She just held my trembling hand tightly, her touch firm and grounding. She struck a match and lit a single, half-burned candle, placing it on the wooden table between us. In the flickering yellow light, she reached into her worn canvas bag and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was a budget she had painstakingly written out on the back of a diner receipt. "I talked to the landlord of a small boarding house 3 blocks away, Mom," she said softly, keeping her eyes on the paper. It's not a mansion and it's still in this neighborhood, but it's on the second floor. It has a small stove, a window that actually gets sunlight and no damp mold. If I keep working the night shifts, we can afford the deposit by next month. She looked up, her eyes anxious, searching my face not for praise but for permission. I looked at the crumpled receipt, then at my daughter's tired, hollow eyes, seeing the genuine, exhausting effort she was putting into rebuilding the life she had once so easily destroyed. I didn't smile, and I didn't tell her that all was forgotten, but I reached out and gently laid my hand over hers on the table. We will pack our things next week, Lily, I said quietly. It was a small step, but as she let out a long, shaky breath of relief, I knew the foundation of our broken relationship was finally, slowly, beginning to dry and set. The move to the small second-floor boarding room was anything but glamorous. It was an exhausting day of carrying our few heavy, worn-out cardboard boxes up a narrow, creaky flight of wooden stairs, my joints aching with every step, while Lily insisted on carrying the heaviest loads herself. When we finally closed the door behind us, we were both gasping for breath, surrounded by bare, peeling walls and the faint smell of old floor polish. But as the afternoon sun filtered through the small, clean window, casting a warm patch of light onto the dusty floorboards, the room felt different from the dark, suffocating basement we had left behind. There was no mold here, and for the first time in over a year, we could look out and see a small patch of the open sky instead of a brick wall. That night, after a simple dinner of boiled potatoes, my body was entirely spent. I sat heavily on the edge of the small bed, my hands trembling slightly from the exertion of the day. Lily noticed. Without saying a word, she walked over to the corner of the room, grabbed a plastic basin, and filled it with warm water from our small, single-burner stove. She brought it over, placed it gently before my feet, and knelt down on the hard floor. As she reached out to gently slip off my worn, scuffed shoes, I instinctively pulled back, my guard still partially up. But Lily stayed still, looking up at me with eyes that were tired but completely steady. "Please, Mom," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Just let me do this." I slowly let my feet sink into the warm water, and Lily began to gently wash away the dust of our move. Her hands, which had once been so clean and delicate, were now rough and calloused, but her touch was incredibly tender. As she worked in silence, a single, quiet tear escaped her eye and splashed into the basin. There were no grand declarations of success, no sudden promotions, and we were still very much living on the edge of poverty. But as I looked down at my daughter kneeling on the bare floorboards of this humble room, willingly humbling herself to care for the mother she had once discarded, I realized that the superficial girl she used to be had truly died in that storm. The road ahead of us was still long, steep, and uncertain, but in the quiet warmth of that room, the heavy, icy barrier that had separated us for so long finally began to melt away. The transition into our new boarding room brought a quiet sense of relief, but the daily struggle for survival didn't magically disappear. Our life was still measured in pennies and carefully budgeted meals. The second-floor room was warmer, yes, but the walls were thin, and we could hear the constant, loud hum of the city streets and the arguments of our neighbors through the floorboards. My health remained a fragile, unpredictable thing. Some mornings I could stand long enough to cook a simple pot of rice, while on other days, a deep, rattling cough would keep me pinned to the bed for hours. Lily, seeing my strength wane, pushed herself even harder. She began waking up at 4 in the morning to help the diner owner prep the kitchen before her actual shift started, just to earn a few extra scraps of food and a tiny bonus at the end of the week. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the rain-slicked streets below, Lily came home carrying a small, heavy paper bag. Her face was pale and she was shivering, but there was a quiet, intense focus in her eyes. Instead of putting her wages on the table as she usually did, she sat on the edge of my bed and carefully opened the bag. Inside was a thick, woolen thermal wrap and a small bottle of expensive cough syrup, the exact brand the doctor had recommended months ago, which we could never afford. I stared at the medicine, then at her. I knew the cost of that bottle was equivalent to 3 days of her hard labor. "How did you pay for this, Lily?" I asked, my voice laced with a sudden protective worry. Lily looked down, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the woolen wrap. "I didn't steal it, Mom, I promise," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "The diner owner. He needed someone to clean the grease traps under the deep fryers." None of the other workers would do it because the chemicals are harsh and the space is too tight. I volunteered. It took me 3 hours after my shift ended. She slowly held out her hands, and my heart ached. Her fingers were raw, the skin peeling and stained with stubborn black soot that no amount of soap could wash away. She had crawled into the dark, filthy spaces of a kitchen floor just so I could breathe a little easier at night. In that moment, looking at her ruined hands, the last lingering wall of bitterness in my heart didn't just crack, it completely crumbled. I didn't say a word. I simply reached out, took her bruised, soot-stained hands in mine, and pulled her close. For the first time in years, Lily let her guard down completely, burying her face in my shoulder and weeping silently, not out of shame, but out of the sheer relief of finally being held by her mother again. The morning after that breakdown, the air inside our small room felt noticeably lighter, as if a suffocating weight had finally been lifted from our chests. We didn't suddenly stop being poor, and my cough didn't miraculously vanish, but the emotional distance that had kept us living like two strangers sharing a cell was completely gone. As Lily quietly prepared to leave for her grueling shift, she didn't look at me with the anxious, pleading eyes of a guilty child anymore. Instead, there was a steady, resilient calm in her expression. For the first time, before she walked out the door, I reached over and adjusted the worn collar of her coat, telling her softly to be careful. A small, genuine smile broke across her tired face, a sight I hadn't seen in over a year. With our relationship finally healing, Lily's focus shifted from merely surviving day to day to trying to build something sustainable. Her relentless work ethic at the diner hadn't gone unnoticed. The owner, a gruff but fair man named Marcus, realized she was far more educated and organized than the usual hands he hired. One afternoon, after caught her efficiently fixing a major error in the diner's monthly supply ledger, he called her into his small, cramped back office. He didn't offer her a corporate promotion or a fancy title, but he did offer her the position of daytime cashier and inventory manager, which came with a modest raise, and more importantly, meant she would no longer have to scrub floors or clean grease traps until midnight. She came home that evening carrying a small plastic container of fresh vegetable soup and a loaf of actual bakery bread, her eyes shining with a quiet, grounded pride. As we sat at our small table, sharing a meal that felt like a feast compared to our usual boiled potatoes, she didn't boast about her new role or talk about getting rich again. "It's a few extra dollars a week, Mom," she said quietly, her rough hands wrapped tightly around her warm teacup. "But it means I'll be home before dark. It means I can cook for you, and we can actually save enough to get you to a proper clinic next month." Listening to her plan for my health instead of her own wardrobe, I looked at the faded photo of Robert on the wall, wishing he could see the woman our daughter was finally becoming. A woman whose true value was no longer defined by the money in her bank account, but by the depth of her sacrifice. The promise Lily made wasn't an empty one. Within a month of her taking over the diner's inventory, our tiny, meticulously managed savings envelope grew just enough for us to make the trip to a small neighborhood clinic. The doctor, a kind man with tired eyes, listened to my chest, wrote down a list of affordable daily medications, and told me that with proper rest and a dust-free environment, my lungs would slowly recover. Sitting in that sterile waiting room, watching Lily carefully count out the exact bills to pay the receptionist, I realized how much our roles had completely reversed. The daughter I had carried for so many years was now quietly, firmly carrying me. But life in our crowded district had a way of reminding us how fragile our peace really was. A week after our clinic visit, as Lily was walking home from the diner in the dim twilight, a sleek, expensive black car slowly pulled up along the cracked pavement of our street. The passenger window rolled down, revealing a face Lily hadn't seen since her downfall, Richard, her former husband. He looked as polished and wealthy as ever, but his eyes were cold as they scanned the rundown buildings, finally resting on Lily's worn coat and scuffed shoes. He smirked, leaning back against his leather seat. "I heard you were working in some greasy kitchen, but I had to see it to believe it," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You went from a mansion to the gutters, Lily. If you want, I can talk to a few associates. Get you a decent desk job. It's pathetic seeing you like this." A year ago, such a confrontation would have sent Lily into a spiral of humiliation, anger, or desperate begging. But as she stood on the cold, damp sidewalk, she didn't flinch. She looked at Richard, the man she had once betrayed her own mother to please, and felt absolutely nothing. She saw the hollow luxury of his car, the fake smile on his face, and realized how empty that world truly was. "No thank you, Richard," Lily replied, her voice remarkably calm and steady. "I finally have everything I actually need right here." She didn't wait for his response. She turned her back on him and his expensive car, walking away without a single backward glance. When she opened the door to our second-floor room, she was slightly out of breath, but her face was filled with a profound sense of freedom. She sat on the floor beside my chair, resting her head against my knee. "I saw Richard today, Mom," she whispered. I stiffened, my heart skipping a beat, but Lily gently squeezed my hand. And for the first time in my life, I realized I am richer now than I ever was with him. Richard's sudden appearance had been a test, but the true victory was how quickly his shadow vanished from our lives. He didn't chase after her, and Lily didn't waste a single tear or thought on the hollow world he represented. Instead, that encounter seemed to solidify something deep inside her. The last trace of longing for her old, glamorous life was gone, replaced by a fierce, quiet contentment with the humble reality we were building together. As summer set in, the small boarding room became hot and stuffy, but my lungs were finally clearing up thanks to the daily medicine Lily had sacrificed so much to buy. I could walk around the room without gasping for air, and I even began handling the light cooking again, wanting Lily to come home to a warm meal after her long hours at the diner. Her routine at Marcus's diner had become the backbone of our existence. She managed the registers, handled the supplier disputes, and kept the books so perfectly that Marcus began leaving her in charge of the entire place for days at a time. He trusted her completely, and the regular customers grew fond of the quiet, polite woman who always remembered their names. One evening, Lily came home with an old, battered ledger under her arm and a look of deep contemplation on her face. She sat at the table, spreading out her notes, and called me over. "The owner of the small bakery next to the diner is retiring, Mom," she said, her voice carrying a nervous but excited energy. "He wants to sell his old industrial oven and his small storefront lease. Marcus offered to partner with me. He will put up half the money if I manage the space and do the baking. He knows how hard I work, and he knows we need a real step up." She looked up at me, her fingers tightly gripping her pencil. "I know how to manage a business now, Mom. I learned it the hard way, through sweat and numbers. But I don't want to make fancy pastries for ungrateful crowds. I want to bake simple, affordable bread and hearty meals for the working people in this district, the people who actually supported us when we had nothing." I looked at the rough sketches and numbers she had drawn on the paper. There was no greed in her eyes, no desire to climb back into a high society mansion to look down on others. She wanted to build something with her own calloused hands to serve the very community that had taken us in. I reached out, placing my hand over her sketches, and smiled. "Your father always said that honest bread tastes sweeter than a stolen feast, Lily," I murmured. "Let's do it." The opening of our tiny bakery didn't come with a grand ribbon-cutting ceremony or a crowd of wealthy guests. It began in the quiet, freezing dark of a 3 o'clock morning, with the comforting, heavy scent of yeast and rising dough filling the small, warm shop. Lily's days became longer than ever, her alarm waking her while the rest of the city was still asleep. She would spend hours kneading dough, her arms aching and her face lightly dusted with white flour, working alongside Marcus to get the first fresh loaves ready for the early morning laborers. My health didn't allow me to stand by the hot ovens, but I found my own quiet purpose sitting at the small wooden register near the door, wrapping the warm loaves in brown paper and exchanging gentle nods with the tired dockworkers and sweeping crews who stopped by before their shifts. We weren't making a fortune. After paying back Marcus and covering the rent, our profit was just enough to keep us fed and warm. But for the first time in our lives, every single penny we held was clean, honest, and earned with sweat. As the months turned into a year, the small bakery became the warm, beating heart of our neighborhood. People didn't just come for the affordable bread. They came for the quiet, respectful warmth that Lily offered to everyone who walked through the door. One late afternoon, as the golden autumn sun began to dip below the rooftops, casting long, soft shadows across the wooden floorboards, Lily walked over to the corner of the shop. She had placed Robert's old, restored photograph on a small, clean shelf next to a jar of fresh wildflowers. She stood there for a long moment, quietly wiping a speck of dust from the glass frame with her apron, her face reflecting a deep, serene peace. She walked over to where I sat by the window, kneeling down beside my chair and resting her warm, flower-dusted hands over my worn ones. "We don't have a mansion anymore, Mom," she said softly, looking out at the humble street where children were playing on the cracked pavement. "And my hands will probably never be soft again. But when I look at Dad's picture now, I don't feel ashamed anymore. I feel like he actually recognizes the daughter standing before him." I looked down at her, at the faint lines of hard work around her eyes, her rough fingers, and the beautiful, mature soul that had been forged in the fires of her own downfall. I reached out, gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, my heart overflowing with a quiet, boundless gratitude. We had lost our wealth, our social standing, and the grand illusions we once chased, but in the ruins of our old life, we had found something far more enduring. As the evening bells of the neighborhood church began to ring in the distance, I pulled my daughter close, knowing that our long, painful storm had finally ended, leaving us exactly where we belonged, together, humble and truly free.